So good morning and welcome to this IEC symposium. My name is Robert Bissonnette. I'm a dermatologist from Montreal, Canada, and I'm the current president of IEC. You all have seen this QR code. Please use it. If you use it, you'll have access to more information about the program, more information about the speakers. We used to distribute many pieces, sheets of papers with all this. That's not too good for the environment. We've seen that people were taking photos of that, so we turned greener and are now using this QR code. Very good. So the symposia today is about global perspectives in atopic dermatitis, non-atopic challenges in atopic dermatitis patients. So a few housekeeping comments. As usual, this session is being recorded. We do this because we post it online after the meeting so that people can view it at their leisure. As you know, there are many sessions this morning, many competing sessions. Some people could not attend because they wanted to attend another session. It will be possible for everybody to have a look, see what was presented with this recording. All right, IEC. So for those of you who may be less familiar with IEC, IEC is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2014. It is led by dermatologists and allergists who are expert in atopic dermatitis. We currently have 127 atopic dermatitis experts, counselors, and associates from 29 different countries in 5 different regions of the globe. All the countries in orange on that map are countries where we have counselors and associates. If you're a dermatologist or an allergist, and if you're interested in atopic dermatitis, which you're probably are if you're here today, if you do research on ED, if you present on ED, if you talk about ED, if you do patient advocacy related to atopic dermatitis, and you're interested in becoming a member of IEC, please have a look at our website. You will see the conditions to be associates and counselors, and it'll be a pleasure to welcome you. So our mission is focused on education and research. How do we accomplish this? So in terms of education, we are organizing symposia like this one at major international meetings, but also nowadays at major national meetings. And we're present at dermatology meetings and allergy meetings. We also publish. We publish review papers, surveys, opinions about atopic dermatitis in high-impact journals. We have several special projects going on. In terms of research, we fund research fellows. So we have a research fellowship program where we're developing dermatologists who will be leaders in atopic dermatitis in the future. These are corporate sponsors. We would not exist if the corporate sponsors would not support us. I see many familiar faces in the room from different companies, including companies that are listed here. Thank you very much. Without you, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't do anything. If you work for a biotech or a pharma company who has an interest in ED, and if you don't see your corporate logo here, please don't hesitate to come and talk to me or our CEO, Alan Stiles, and we can tell you about becoming a partner, what would be the advantages and what it implies. Good. So 2023 is a very busy year for us. We started the year with our first symposium in allergy. So we were present at a QuadAI meeting in the US. This is an allergist meeting. We had a symposium on atopic dermatitis. We talked about prurigo nodularis at AAD. A few months ago, we were in Tokyo at the ISID meeting. For the first time, we had an in-person symposium in South America, in Brazil, at the REDLA meeting. We're here today. We will be at EADV with a symposium on pruritus in patients with AD, and we will also be in Vienna at the ISDS meeting for a symposium on basic research techniques in atopic dermatitis. Fellowships. So we have a fellowship program, as I mentioned. In fact, we offer two types of fellowships. We offer one-year fellowships, research fellowships, and these fellowships are specifically geared towards recent grads from dermatology who are interested in a career in atopic dermatitis. People who eventually will become the future Emma Gutman and Amy Poehler, and I'm naming those because they're the two founders of IEC. So people who would devote most or a significant portion of their career to atopic dermatitis. We also offer shorter one-month fellowships for people interested to know more about clinical skills needed to be able to treat and diagnose patients with atopic dermatitis. You see on this slide a list of our previous fellows. In 2023, we had a special program that was funded by Sanofi Canada. So thank you. There are Sanofi people in the room, specifically Sanofi Canada. And this program was open to any recent graduate in dermatology worldwide to come to work with a counselor or an associate based in Canada. And I'm pleased to announce that this year's fellow will be RB Sofia Marilano from the Philippines. She will work with Aaron Drucker from the University of Toronto. If you are from a company that is interested in atopic dermatitis, we are looking for help to offer more of these fellowships. And these fellowships could be worldwide, or they could be country-specific. So you might work for a company in Germany, for example, and you would like to organize something like this for the counselors and associates in Germany. It's not easy to organize. It took a lot of work from everybody to get to make this happen, but it's feasible. So please come to talk to us, and we can help you and tell you how it might be done. IEC manuscripts, so this is for counselors and associates. We're always open to new ideas. So if you think about a systematic literature search, if you think about a survey, an opinion paper that you would like to be involved in or you would like to write or work on for IEC, please don't hesitate and come to talk to me or our CEO, Alan Stiles. And that's his email address. Good. So we have two co-chairs today. We have Dr. Jeff Yu and Nick Reynolds. I'll introduce Dr. Yu, and he will talk to you about the very interesting program we have today. So Dr. Yu is currently Assistant Professor of Dermatology at Harvard Medical School. He's Director of Occupational and Contact Dermatitis Clinic at Mass General. He runs a specialized atopic dermatitis clinic caring for complex AD patients ranging from neonates to adults. He received, among others, a prestigious award from the Dermatology Foundation. He received the Dermatology Foundation Pediatric Career Development Award. I could go on and on and on and have many other lines, but I'm convinced that we have a great co-chair, and I'll let him introduce the speakers today and the agenda.
All right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Welcome, everybody, to our session. I'm so glad that you guys are able to kick off your World Congress of Dermatology experience with us here at the International Eczema Council. I mean, what a good time it is to be in atopic dermatitis, right? The amount of interest that we have seen from dermatologists, from pediatric dermatologists, from allergists, and especially from industry over the last few years has been absolutely incredible. I was recently at a meeting where just a few years ago, the number of industry partners in the corporate council was about 3 or 4, and this year there were over 12 members in that corporate council alone. So I think there's been kind of a dramatic rise in terms of interest for atopic dermatitis. Now, you wouldn't be here today if you guys were not interested in AD, and I think most of us are very well versed in some of the novel treatments that we have for AD targeting type 2 inflammation. However, we're also beginning to realize a lot that AD is much more than just a skin disease. AD has a lot of non-atopic complications, and I think that's the focus of the program today. We're going to talk to you guys about not just the itching rash that you get in AD, but some of the other comorbidities, including things such as mental health. That's incredibly important. We have a host of great speakers today that you guys can see if you guys scan the QR code, but I'm going to bring them up here as well. So briefly, we're going to start off with understanding the relationship of atopic dermatitis with obesity and other metabolic comorbidities. We're going to talk about AD and mental health comorbidity, which is incredibly important, not just in children, but also in adults. We are also going to take a break around 10 o'clock for a bathroom break as well as a refreshment break. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk to you all about allergic contact dermatitis in patients with AD, something that we thought was impossible maybe just 1 or 2 decades ago. We're going to get a really interesting perspective from patients about how non-atopic comorbidities affect these AD patients. And then we're going to finally talk about digital technologies and how we can really use this novel technology to diagnose as well as treat atopic dermatitis for our patients. And perhaps this can provide really important information for treatment providers as well as for further development in therapeutics as well. So without further ado, I would like to begin by introducing our first speaker here. And our first speaker is going to be Dr. Yik-Wen Yu. He is a senior consultant dermatologist at the National Skin Center here in Singapore. He's the deputy head of the NSC Research Division and head of the Eczema Clinic. He's an assistant professor at the Lee Kong Chian School of Medicine at NTU Singapore. He's got a strong research and clinical interest in atopic dermatitis, psoriasis dermatoepidemiology, and disease outcome research. He's written over 90 peer-reviewed scientific publications and extremely active in outcomes research, and I'm sure he is the perfect person today to talk to us about the relationship of atopic dermatitis with obesity and other metabolic comorbidities. So I'd like to welcome him to the stage.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. I would like to thank the International Eczema Council for inviting me to give this presentation on understanding the relationship of atopic dermatitis with obesity and other metabolic comorbidities. As a Singaporean and also as a member of the NOC, I would also like to welcome everyone to Singapore for the WCD meeting. So a brief outline of today's presentation. First of all, I'll give an overview of the evidence surrounding the association of atopic dermatitis and obesity and other metabolic comorbidities. Then I'll focus on local data illustrating the two conditions, and subsequently I'll focus more on current local research studies that has been done to illustrate the mechanism between AD and obesity. Without further ado, I'll start. So some disclosure here. So we all might understand and has been published widely that AD has important disease associations with many different chronic medical diseases. And that's perhaps what today's symposium focus is about. And it's from this observation that might be a strong possibility that, in fact, because there's inflammation and systemic immune activation, it therefore leads to these various different comorbidities. Oops. Press the wrong button. So for evidence surrounding adiposity and AD, we know that overweight and obesity is associated with an increased prevalence, and not only so, it's also associated with an increased severity. So those with more severe AD are more likely to be obese or associated with various cardiometabolic conditions. So in this relatively busy slide, whereby this systematic review and meta-analysis, it looks at various cardiovascular outcomes ranging from angina, heart failure, as well as myocardial infarct. As you can see, that there has been, it's rather varied across the different cardiovascular outcomes. From the top left with the angina as outcome, there's positive association, but for example, for heart failure and myocardial infarct, it crosses the midline, and there is no statistical significance. Now, if you look at the same study that evaluates the cardiovascular disease outcomes with the eczema severity, you can easily look at the lower panel, which illustrates that the higher eczema severity is all associated with angina, even cardiovascular death and heart failure, as well as ischemic stroke. However, there have been other published studies that also look at AD and cardiovascular disease that did not show a statistical significance. And there will be various study groups that try to explain why this is so. And perhaps one of the most direct explanations would be often the disease definition of atopic dermatitis in epidemiology cohorts can be challenging. For those who do atopic dermatitis epidemiology research, you understand that if you want to have a large enough cohort, often your disease definition can be challenging. So it can range from very non-specific methodologies, such as asking whether patients ever been diagnosed with atopic dermatitis, or you can use a very detailed diagnosis criteria, like for example, the Hanifi and Raika criteria, and it can take a lot of time, and that therefore impacts on your diagnosis of AD. And there have been various proposals, for example, using a modified UK Working Party criteria as an intermediate compromise between the true definition of atopic dermatitis. And some groups have proposed that perhaps using just a self-reported modified UK Working Party criteria, whereby you fulfill the major criteria of each, and at least 2 out of the 4 minor criteria UK Working Party criteria would be recommended in various large epidemiology cohort studies. And only the investigator observed criteria is omitted in this case. Now, next, I just share with you some evidence that's published from the local Singapore. So in Singapore, for those who might understand, we have a conscripted army. That means all Singaporean males, including previously myself, have to undergo a 2 years national service, and therefore they undergo medical screening at standardized centers before they're enlisted. That, in a way, provides a very standardized and uniform, whereby all male population of Singapore aged between 18 to 20 are being screened. So we have a large-scale kind of medical data repository which we can look at. And when we look at this database, which I fortunately have access to, we realized that we need to study about a total of 10,000 personnel had a diagnosis of AD by a medical physician in the military service itself. Now, when we look at specifically at the comorbidities of obesity and cardiovascular disease, we realize that, of course, first of all, it's associated with obesity, and it's also associated with certain measures of the cardiovascular risk factors such as type 2 diabetes or hypertension, hyperlipidemia. And when they have one or more conditions, it's also positively associated with a risk of being diagnosed with AD. Now, when we look at, for example, if you have a diagnosis of atopic dermatitis, how many of these metabolic comorbidities do you have? Take note that this is a cohort of a relatively young cohort, in the sense they are 18 to 19, but still a lot of them are diagnosed with high blood pressure or hyperlipidemia, or previously undiagnosed. If you look at this chart consistently, you can see that for those with one or more metabolic conditions, or 2 or more, or 3 or more, there's almost a dosage increment, whereby those with more metabolic conditions had a higher chance of being diagnosed with moderate to severe atopic dermatitis. Now, going back to moving away from the cardiovascular comorbidities, if you look at obesity and overweight participants, if you look at this various systematic review and meta-analysis that has been previously performed, you can see that consistently, whether it's across the different regions of the world or between adults and children, there is a positive association between the two conditions. And again, within the same cohort local cohort that I just presented to you, among these conscripted young soldiers, we realized that overweight and obesity is associated with more severe form of AD. Just a brief note on how did we characterize severity. So all these soldiers which were diagnosed with atopic dermatitis, if the severity of atopic dermatitis actually affects the ability to perform active military service, they're often downgraded and assigned appropriate vocation, we call it, or in the clerical work or in the office. So often it goes through a very general, broad medical review that is also being chaired by a dermatologist in presence. So the severity is in a way determined by a clinical dermatologist. Now, we are often faced with this problem of epidemiology association studies, because for association study and observational studies, we are unable to prove causation. And often there's a lot of confounders, and it's often affected by your disease definition. So there is this technique or a method which you might have come across. It's called Mendelian randomization. Now, Mendelian randomization actually makes use of the fact that our genes or the SNPs, genetic factors, are being randomly assorted at birth. and therefore not affected by any confounding factors that subsequently develops in life. And just a very short explanation of how Mendelian randomization is performed. So first of all, we determine what is your exposure and what is your outcome. So if you look at this slide itself, the top part of the diagram shows that my BMI, which is using to illustrate obesity, is my exposure, AD is my outcome. If you similarly look at the bottom panel, AD is my exposure, BMI is, or obesity is my outcome. So using this method, I'm able to determine not only whether there is association, what direction of association there is. Now, let me just explain the one on the top panel. So if I want to know whether BMI has a causal relationship with atopic dermatitis, I look for genetic factors that is affecting BMI. That means I look at BMI GWAS study, genetic wide association studies. I use these genetic factors as my instruments to calculate and to determine whether BMI has a causal relationship with AD. Now, ordinarily, these known SNPs for BMI would not have a relationship with AD because if there is, we would have removed them. But using this known SNP of BMI, which is at genome-wide significance, and we calculate using various steps to see whether there's an association with AD. Ordinarily, we would not expect so, but if we find there is a significant relation with AD, then there would be a causal relationship in the direction from BMI to atopic dermatitis. Now, in this particular paper or study, which is also being replicated by Professor Sarah Brown group in Edinburgh, that genetically determined increase in adiposity is associated with increased risk of AD. However, the reverse direction is not true. And of course, there's various criteria which I'm not going in depth into, but there's no evidence of confounding from this genetic association, mainly by this concept of horizontal pleiotropy. Now, when we look at that, it seems that there's a causal relationship from the direction of BMI to AD, although the effect estimate or the magnitude of the effect is quite low. But I would argue that for every 1 unit increase of BMI, if there's a 10% increased risk of AD, that would be rather significant for some individuals. So often from this study, we already could see that in observational studies, there's a relationship between the two conditions, and perhaps there is a causal direction from BMI leading to AD. Then what are the mechanisms that's linking the obesity with atopic dermatitis? And that becomes one of my the topic for my PhD thesis. If we looked into pathogenesis of AD, trying to give some clues on how AD could be affected by BMI. This is a relatively well-summarized slide that AD is often affected by, manifested by pruritus, barrier dysfunction, immune dysregulation, and perhaps also confounded by skin microbiome and perhaps genetic factors. And therefore, we have some hypothesis in my local group where how adiposity could lead to AD if this was true. And we believe that perhaps adiposity leads to some epidermal barrier dysfunction, leads to systemic inflammation. After all, adiposity is a systemic inflammatory disease. And there could be loss of skin antimicrobial peptides and lipids that therefore subsequently leads to the development of AD, or perhaps it's just through the microbiome route. Now, some aims, so first of all, we have to determine in this Singapore adult population cohort of about 10,000 participants. Currently, we have reached about 20,000, but we want to first of all determine what's the prevalence of AD and the association. And there we focus on certain hypotheses that I've just mentioned. We measure skin physiology in all of them, their skin microbiome profile, and of course perform some serum biomarkers to determine whether it could be systemically immune activated. And just a brief slide on what this local population cohort was about. So it's an adult cohort from 30 to 84-year-old. They go through about 4 hours of intense survey, but they are in general healthy. They are not dermatology specific, but there's a dermatology domain that specifically collects their information, measures the skin physiology, and collect their skin tips. So following what we have understand, we couldn't, of course, station a dermatologist there to screen through all these 10,000 participants. We have to rely on this proposed 2 out of 4 modified UK Working Party criteria. And of course, we did some validation study before that. And how do we classify adiposity? I mean, if you have read in the literature very recently, there is this debate on whether to not recognize BMI as a measure of adiposity. So at that time, not only we measure BMI, we also look at waist, hip circumference, and ratio. There's DEXA scan that's performed in every individual in the population cohort study that we can look at visceral fat mass. This was some results from the analysis. So we did realize that in our observational study, despite in 10,000 participants, actually it did not reach statistical significance, but in the visceral fat mass as well as in the waist-hip ratio kind of measures of adiposity, there was a positive relationship in our cohort. So what was the result summary? So our local prevalence is about 8.8% among adults, which is consistent with our previous Singapore studies. But general obesity was not significantly associated with risk of AD in this cohort during this analysis. But abdominal and visceral obesity was significantly associated with increased risk of atopic dermatitis. And next, I mentioned about skin physiology. Again, we have skin physiology measurements in terms of transepidermal water loss, skin surface moisture in terms of capacitance, as well as skin pH. When we classify according to the categories of normal, overweight, and obese, we do see a very simplistic overview that there is increased transepidermal water loss, there's decreased skin surface moisture. Some may argue that in obese participants, especially if they do sweat more, would this affect the results? And therefore, we actually, other than the fact that there is both transepidermal water loss and skin surface moisture as to verify, we also actually rest the participants for at least 20 to 30 minutes. And during that time, they're actually performing other stations or other system domains while waiting for the skin physiology measurements to be performed. And they're actually doing their visual eye checks during this time period. Now, if you look at this, we actually realized that for log transform kind of skin physiology measures, there is increased transepidermal water loss in obese individuals and reduction of skin surface moisture. We originally expect perhaps a more alkaline pH as it will be more consistent with skin barrier dysfunction, but we realized that they tend to have an acidic pH. But that's another debate altogether, but perhaps not for today. Now, when we actually did a regression against all various different types of obesity measures, again, we see some consistent results in the sense that there is increased water loss and more dry skin regardless of whichever obesity measures that we do. And previously, we had an expanded cohort to look at maybe 15,000 or more, adjusting for other confounding factors. Again, we reported that is increased transepidermal water loss and a reduced skin surface moisture with increasing obesity. Now, remember during the initial part of my presentation, I talked about the challenges of having an observational studies. We similarly follow up with a Mendelian randomization experiment to see whether there could be a causal relationship or could it be confounded by various factors. We were pleasantly surprised, or rather not surprised, we were pleasantly happy to find that there is perhaps a causal kind of relationship when we use this method of Mendelian randomization that genetically determined increased risk in BMI was associated with increased transepidermal water loss, but for skin moisture and pH, there wasn't. It is quite significant in that sense that perhaps in a lot of different genome-wide association studies, they do not look at skin physiology parameters, but because we have an opportunity to measure in about 10,000 participants and we have their genetic information, we could run an analysis for this. So again, what was the summary of this skin physiology experiment with obesity? We realized that obesity associated with increased transepidermal water loss, reduced skin surface moisture, but a more acidic pH, and perhaps there might be skin barrier dysfunction in obese individuals. And that could be the link between why obese individuals tend to have increased risk of atopic dermatitis. Now, next segment, we look at skin microbiome, which at that point, a few years ago, and it still is a topic of interest. We understand that in atopic dermatitis, the skin microbiome is often less diverse. So could this be the reason why an obese individual might have a less diverse AD? less diverse microbiome and therefore associated with AD. Now, in our cohort itself, unfortunately, we do not have data at that point to have 10,000 skin microbiome. That would be very expensive and a huge experiment to perform. But we perform for this particular experiment about 300 individuals who have skin microbiome that's being processed and measured from the volar forearms, the flexuals. And we realized that there's no difference in diversity measures between the two, although there seemed to be some separation, but it did not reach statistical significance. Next, we look at skin microbiome at the species level to look at whether how the skin microbiome species in terms of proportional prevalence might be related to increasing BMI picture. We realized that if you have increasing BMI, there is an increased amount of Corynebacterium, which is a skin commencer, but we did not expect to find any, for example, Staph aureus to be more increased in obese individuals. And perhaps skin microbiome is just a rather complicated domain to look at because it's been affected by many different external factors, and therefore we did not have a very clear relationship between the two. So this is what we found. We did find some commensals, but in general, we did not have a very clear explanation that this could be the mechanism behind why obesity leads to AD. Next, we look at serum proteomics to look at whether certain cytokines that was associated with obesity might be elevated in our Asian cohort. There have been various discussions that in the Asian eczema phenotype is more of IL-17, more Th1 pattern in addition to Th2 kind of immune cytokines. So particularly look at things like certain IL-17 family of cytokines, but we realized that although when we regress against the adiposity measures, there are some significance in terms of the usual biomarkers such as your serum TARC or CCL17, but we realized that certain cytokines were more elevated that was associated with both obesity and atopic dermatitis. And more work is still being done in this area. So like I presented, so some eczema, several atopic dermatitis associated chemokines or cytokines are associated with increasing BMI. Now, some brief summary. I know I presented quite an amount of information with regards to the study. So some general information. We found that and we observed that genetically determined increase in adiposity is associated with an increased risk of AD. And we've shown that whether is it in observed studies or in genetic studies, increasing barrier function was associated with increased degree of adiposity. In fact, adiposity having a causal relationship with having this increased barrier dysfunction. We noted differences in microbiome species, but at the moment, there is no clear distinction. And we also investigated AD-associated cytokines in obese individuals. What I have not presented that we are currently performing is that we are also looking into skin surface metabolites as well as molecules to see whether they might be affected or not. So some studies still need to be done with regards to the association between AD, especially with other cardiovascular diseases. It's not as clear as how psoriasis association with cardiovascular disease is. We know that the average association of AD with obesity is about 1.5 in the magnitude, but for psoriasis, the odds ratio is about 2.5. It's a highly more immune kind of skin condition. So more needs to be done, and with the opportunity, with a lot of next generation sequencings or omics developments, we are able to have large-scale data in a large-scale population cohort. And we could, from our understanding between AD and obesity, also understand how other similar chronic comorbidities might affect skin biology. And in fact, both AD and obesity are conditions with very huge disease burden. And if we could prevent or mitigate the disease burden just by increasing the awareness among dermatologists that it is important to tend to the cardiovascular comorbidities, that would really make a change to patients. And be it using the classical epidemiology concept or using the modern epidemiology methods, it's really important to further understanding. As you have read in the literature, there have been increasing studies in using genetic information as well as using the technique of Mendelian randomization to address various of these questions that we are still, in a way, trying to answer. And finally, is my acknowledgement slides. I really have to thank my PhD mentors and collaborators that I work with in terms of the omics analysis and my access to the national database. And this was funded by my clinician scientist career scheme as well as the Helios ADC grant. And with that, thank you.
So we are open for questions after the speaker. So if you guys have questions, please don't be shy. Yes.
Thank you for this very, very interesting presentation. I'm very intrigued by your findings of increased transepidermal water loss in obese patients. And I have a few questions related to that. So as you mentioned, transepidermal water loss is an indirect technique to look at the barrier function, and it could be influenced by sweating. So you took care of minimizing activity influence on sweating. But it might be, I don't know, that obese patients do sweat more, and this is the reason why you observe that. So my first question is, could you speculate on the mechanisms that could, by which obesity could have an impact on the barrier function? Two, have you looked at other ways of assessing the skin barrier, looking at barrier protein, gene expression? And my third question, I don't know if you'll remember the three of them, is I was curious to see if when you did transepidermal water loss, you also did it following tape stripping, which could be, could give you some more information in terms of barrier fragility.
Okay, thank you for your question. So first of all, when we look at it, we try to adjust to allow the patient to acclimatize. Our hypothesis of why is what we fail to address is that although we can allow the patient to be in a way in the environment for longer, in the sense that they might not sweat, but what we have not taken into account in an obese individual, there could be a possibility of increased density of sweat glands. So this is something that we can't adjust for. And because when there's increased density of sweat glands, even if they are not actively sweating, when we're measuring transepidermal water loss, the chamber on the equilibration could have collected more sweat. What we would perhaps need to do, and perhaps a bit difficult to do, was that we have another hypothesis of how obesity leads to perhaps AD or skin barrier dysfunction, in the sense that we know that previous studies have shown that sweat proteins actually is irritative to atopic dermatitis skin, or to skin patient with skin barrier dysfunction in that sense. So it would be important to actually evaluate the sweat and evaluate whether obese individual, how much do they sweat more and how does it affect that. That's an important piece of puzzle, but to make participants sweat and to collect their sweat in particular, there may be various ways of doing it, but that remains our challenge, or rather the challenge at that point in time. So that's for question one. For the next question on perhaps would it be due to skin surface metabolites, we actually already performed studies in about 400 individuals, which I have not presented. But in obese individuals, although there are changes in there are antimicrobial peptides, but there's no change in the skin surface molecules, for example, things like products of filaggrin or natural moisturizing factors. We did not observe that. We are not sure whether is it because of sample size, and because we're measuring the skin surface metabolites are very notoriously affected by the environment as well. Although what is heartening is that when we use genetic information, we tend to believe that genetic information are a bit, in a way, immune against all these external confounding factors. But on its own, we have to interpret with caution, because there's a lot of other things that could explain a genetic pathway through it, because there could be statistical or mathematical kind of confounding in that sense that we need to adjust for. I would say that we still need more data in that sense, but it seems to be a very weak association between obesity and AD. So some of my colleagues and other people have remained skeptical about the weak association, but we were a bit surprised when we did the genetic association, and not only by our group, but by the group in Edinburgh, also reporting the same association, the same effect measure estimate. So we thought there might be some mechanism, but the mechanism may not be terribly strong. Or a second reason, it could be because the way we diagnose the condition itself, because AD is heterogeneous in that sense. Yes,
Hi, Weng. Great talk, man. I'm wondering, is there any data on obesity in childhood and atopic dermatitis? Because, obesity starts very, very young nowadays, right? Especially in Singapore. So, and the other question I have is, is there any interventional studies where you make the patients lose weight and whether their AD gets better, or you treat the AD and their obesity gets better?
Okay, thanks for the question. So yeah, perhaps I forgot to mention that. So in one of my slides, I did present that in the systematic review by Professor Silverberg, there was a subgroup analysis that looked at pediatric groups, and again, it is consistent with what is reported in adults. Yes, there is an interventional study. So I am performing. In fact, we have already collected the data. We had 25 individuals, or we have more actually. We have 25 obese participants. We make them lose weight. And that's not part of the research program. So they were already undergoing weight loss due to another research study that looks at how making them lose weight will improve their diabetic control. So that was my mentor actually was doing this. But we make use of this convenience in the sense that we measure the skin physiology measurements, we did tape strippings and measure the microbiome before and after. But we are currently analyzing, so no results really. But a very preliminary look, there seems to be an improvement, but we still need further analysis. So there is already studies that's ongoing. But even if we do find something that will be supportive, it's still very difficult to prove it, because when you make someone weight loss, many different things happens. Their diet changes, they might exercise more in a way, so they may feel psychologically better. So all this will confound your relationship, which is going to be a bit difficult to tease out, especially with a cohort of about 25. We actually had 50, but we decided, so we only have money to analyze 25 samples anyway. So it's going to be challenging to show any significant results. Yeah.
So I do have a question. Perfect. Okay. So I'm guessing. So if I understand correctly, your analysis was predominantly done in the Singaporean population, which is predominantly Asian. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know if this analysis and these results would hold true for other populations in the world, including Africans, Hispanic, Caucasian, for example?
So the observed relationship between AD and obesity, I mean, due to the observational studies, they are pretty much consistent across the different regions. And regions are qualified by those that publish the studies. Unfortunately, in a lot of countries, it's not well represented in the systematic review. That's number one. As far as when we did the research, I think for obesity and skin microbiome in the US, the American Gut Microbiome Study, they did look at whether there's any changes in skin microbiome that's associated with BMI, not particularly AD, but just BMI alone. They did see a difference. In fact, they did see a diversity change in their cohort, but their cohort is pretty much bigger in that sense.
Thank you. Yes, over here.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, in our experience, usually AD patients that are obese or overweight are usually those that are depressed or with anxiety or with HATs in high levels. So I was wondering if you get to know the psychology and psychiatry status of your patients, and if you took that into account to your bias analysis.
Yes, so we acknowledge that that actually initially we were wondering whether the association between obesity and AD, could it be because you have AD and therefore you tend not to want to go out, you tend not to want to exercise more, you feel upset in the sense that that could be the direction from AD leading to obesity. Likewise, from obesity to AD, like you rightly mentioned, those who are more obese might be a bit concerned about their body image, they will be a bit psychologically depressed in that sense, and that would lead to AD. Yes, so easily there could be other confounding factors too, but we were hoping that using the Mendelian randomization, it has tend to remove all these factors in that that sense that therefore that there will not be any confounding and it will only be at all the genetic factors that are leading to it. I do admit that because there are many, so both conditions, be it obesity, AD, as well as psychological comorbidities, they are very easily confounded by many factors, and so it's going to be difficult to tease them out. So therefore, we need further techniques, and not only in my opinion, not only by expanding the amount of cohorts that we have or by adjusting for the number of confounders we have, we probably might not find the answer. We probably have to rely on other kind of strategies, be it intervention studies or further genetic studies to address this. That's my opinion, yeah.
Hi, Weng. Thanks for the great talk. I'm just thinking, because we always know that obese people or children have a higher tendency for AD because they tend to perspire more and they are less active, maybe. So it's interesting because, in my opinion, I'm just thinking back, a lot of my severe AD patients are actually more underweight and they're pediatric AD. I'm a pediatric dermatologist. So I have quite a number of obese children, but usually they're not as severe as the very severe ones. All of them, the BMI are actually average to below average. So it's very interesting for me to see that there's actually a genetic account for why there is more severe AD in obesity. Do you have pediatric studies, or are you considering one that we can work together?
Yeah, definitely happy to work together. I get this question a lot of times from my own colleagues and other researchers. In fact, because Sarah Brown does the same research, and she was recently here in Singapore, I went to ask her, actually, does she get the same questions? And often over the time, a lot of my colleagues say that, but my AD patients are all almost very thin, very malnourished, and things like that. My answer to your question is that for those patients, for this rather thin or underweight patient with severe AD, if they have put on weight, the AD will have been worse. Likewise, for obese participants who have very mild AD, if they have lost weight, their AD will have even become milder. That's my understanding of it. I do have participants which are obese, after they lose weight, their AD improves. That is, I mean, including myself actually. But it's very difficult. I understand that. I get a lot of such questions all the time. Sometimes those who believe in what I believe in feels that other people who are observing that thinner people have more eczema and just perhaps a bit biased, or perhaps I'm a bit biased. So therefore, I think it's important to perform all these studies in a robust manner to address this question. Yeah.
One thought I had just with your question too, at least in the US, what's really popular amongst kids who have AD is allergy testing. So a lot of times you just go and get empiric allergy testing, which I think is a horrible idea. But a lot of them get empiric allergy testing when their AD is flaring and now you're positive to 5 different foods. So the parents are not feeding the kid milk, they're not giving the kid peanuts, they're not giving the kid whatever it may be. And so therefore a lot of the kids I do see with severe AD are very thin, partly because they're like, oh, I can't eat X, Y, and Z. Well, what are you eating? I'm eating rice and chicken, you know? So they're not eating a lot of foods in general to kind of make them bulk up. Same thing happened to my daughter, but essentially now she's just kind of eating off of like milk and cheese, so she's kind of, you know, bulking up that way. But I wonder if that's true in Singapore as well, or in other countries where there's a lot of food allergy testing that gets done empirically in kids with AD.
Yes, so Singapore is a country whereby there are lots of different food, and our Asian population love eating. So whenever there's anything goes wrong, they blame the food, essentially. So they would, indeed, I mean, I think my colleagues over at the Children's Hospital agree with me that a lot of parents or even adults ask for allergy testing. So food allergy is the one that they want to be tested. In a secondary group, they will ask to be tested against environmental agents, things like dust mites or things like that. I could understand, but they often ask for food allergy testing rather than patch tests. And contact dermatitis, which is another topic altogether, but often I think underappreciated, underreported, at least among our patients locally in that sense. Yeah.
Yes, up here in the front. Question. Do we still have the microphone? Oh.
I come from Brazil, and one of the reasons that
So we adjusted for asthma, but we have data on oral steroid use, but because it's often intermittent, we do not have like for their cumulative dose, so we did not adjust for them, but we did adjust for presence of asthma. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I think we should thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much.
All right, it is my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. John Chit. He is a dermatologist and pediatrician from Melbourne, Australia. He's the clinical director of dermatology at Eastern Health Melbourne and a research at the Murdoch Children Research Institute, Royal Children's Hospital at the University of Melbourne. He's an adjunct clinical professor at Monash University. He's got an interest in atopic dermatitis and inflammation, inflammatory dermatoses, pediatric dermatology, and clinical trials, and is currently undertaking further studies in psychology. He's going to be talking to us today about addressing atopic dermatitis and the mental health comorbidity. Pull up the presentation here.
Thank you, Jeff, and to the organisers for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's very cold where I come from right now, but it has good days. Just some disclosures. I see children at the Children's Hospital and some adults as well with eczema at an adult hospital. Normally we're quite warm, so hopefully we can welcome you one day. So just to start with, comorbidities is a huge topic, and I think I've been privileged to be given this topic because it's a really unique interface as a neuroectodermal tissue that we see the brain interacting with the skin. And there are many layers of intersection that I'd like to allude to over the talk. Particularly, I'll be talking about some the commonly described morbidities, depression, anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity, and cognition issues, as well as the overlap with itch and insomnia. Personality plays a role in all this as a mediating influence, and I'll allude to that throughout the talk. It's somewhat overlapping in the content, and hopefully you can bear with me on that. So my interest came when I was still a resident about 30 years ago, and doing clinics in eczema, at the time I noticed that there were a huge impact on a lot of lives of the people we were seeing, the families. And at that stage, we had a questionnaire called the Stein and Reisman questionnaire, which is not so popularly used these days. But one of the 4 domains that it examined was self-mastery. And it was quite interesting when we were doing one of these studies as part of my training, that the scores were quite divergent and quite revealing about the different responses that families and individuals had to their disease. We found that the impact was greater than that of diabetes when you're looking at moderate to severe eczema, and even the mild group came comparable. But what was it about the condition that was causing this, and why did the outcomes differ so much between affected individuals? So of the early studies that we see from the 1970s, a number of parameters are described. Apologies for the slight verbosity here. Anxiety and hostility were described as characteristics of patients with atopic dermatitis, and it came out as a recurrent theme, and then came the more finer points of depression and neuroticism and hypochondriasis, as it was understood then. My boss at the time had a psychologist that he worked very closely with, and they looked at 40 adult patients with atopic dermatitis, and they noticed that the criticism and the anchor was often directed to the self and not outside. So even though they often viewed things from an outside perspective, the anger seemed to be contained. And subsequently, another study in the 90s showed that children and, this was adults with atopic dermatitis, yes, they often felt anger, but there was a difficulty expressing that anger, and also an assessment that they were not being effective in their expression. And of course, this ties in with what we know about relative lack of assertion and sometimes anxiety that we may see in our patients. So Dr. Wallenberg and his colleagues wrote a little review and expanded on the point of the issue of stress and the skin, stress and the person. And he looked at a number of different levels of stress responses at the level of the skin barrier and the immune system, at the way that we respond to that by itching in our social behavior subsequently. And then there was an allusion to this word alexithymia, as a somewhat of a tying in together theme for this. And they also used the term general adaptation syndrome as the sum of non-specific systemic reactions that occur in response to extended and continued exposure to stress. So there are various phases that we see with this in terms of the activation of the stress response, resistance and sometimes resilience that may respond, and the issue of chronicity tends to compound the considerations. And of course, we have biological responses that work hand in hand with the neuroendocrine systems. So alexithymia we think about as a personality trait, and it's characterized by a lack of either understanding, processing, or ability to describe emotions. And in hand with that, we often see is a reduced ability to think symbolically, less imagination or fantasy life, somewhat more concrete, and externally oriented cognitive thinking. So with this comes a sort of a confusion, as it were, between identifying feelings, the emotional feelings and that of bodily sensation. So it's like the boundaries are a little bit blurred or the whole concept is somewhat ill-defined. And as a consequence of this, we often see reduced empathy and intuition. It doesn't seem much had followed on until the last couple of years when an Italian group looked at this amongst atopic dermatitis patients. And they looked at a bit over 200 patients and assessed with the EASI score, the NRS, and the Toronto alexithymia scale. And they noticed that alexithymic personality traits of some significance over 51 was observed in about 2/3 of patients with atopic dermatitis compared to the control group of about 1/3. And that high degree of alexithymia was significantly higher, and that it did correlate with the severity of disease. Having said that, if we're looking at the overall data about psychology and atopic dermatitis, this was a systematic review by Dr. Charlie Hoffman's group, which looked at the relationships between atopic dermatitis and, in particular, the symptom severity and psychosocial stresses that have been written and published in the past. And what they observed is, although we have gut feeling understandings of some of these concepts, actual hard evidence is lacking in quite a lot. And in fact, there is a lot more evidence about the triggering of atopic dermatitis by psychosocial stress, that's the thick line, rather than the consequence of mental health problems associated with severe eczema. So I know that literature has been coming out in the last few years, but there's still a relative sparsity of real evidence and understanding of the processes. So to be honest, it wasn't the easiest thing preparing this talk, but hopefully some of it will make some sense. There are a number of parameters that seem to have conflicting evidence amongst publications, in particular the issue of attachment security, social status, actual experienced emotions and coping strategies, as in some papers did suggest that these did affect atopic eczema severity and others did not, but most of the other parameters that they discussed really didn't have any significant bearing. So now I talked about the main three things that we recognize as being the major comorbidities. And in particular, I'd like to outline with reference to a number of things. First, with what we understand of molecular pathways of some of these conditions, in particular depression, and how they may or may not overlap with atopic dermatitis as mechanisms of disease. Concurrent morbidities of sleep deprivation and itch, as they might affect both processes and finally, the personality factors that we think about. There will not be much reference to body image or to chronic illness in itself, which are rather larger than the scope of a talk. So turning first to mental health and depression, the literature on this is a bit greater than the other conditions. 2 meta-analyses have been done together with a number of systematic reviews. And from the 2 main meta-analyses, one suggested that AD carries a double-fold increase in the prevalence of depression and a 4-fold increase in that of suicidal ideation. The other one of 30-odd papers suggested that about 1 in 5 people with AD had depression, which was a little bit higher, not quite twice, that of controls. And that as well as studyable depression, clinical depression, antidepressant use and suicidality was increased. And in this second review, they said it was almost double that of the non-atopic dermatitis patients. Children with AD also noticed higher parental depression compared with those who did not have AD. So a couple of the other notable papers that you've already seen in some of our other presentations on this topic in the past. This was a multi-institutional study which looked at about 500,000 adults. And in this one, they showed, similar to that second meta-analysis, that there was an increase in risk of newly diagnosed depression in patients with atopic dermatitis, and this did seem to correlate to severity of disease. Anxiety was also increased, but for some reason, severity of AD did not seem to correlate with the degree of anxiety, the amount of anxiety. This is a paper from Dr. Silverberg's group, which was a cross-sectional population-based study of about 3,000 patients, and they also noticed the increased prevalence of both anxiety and depression, and that there was correlation with the severity of disease, and importantly made the note that many cases were not picked up clinically until the scales were actually used. With regards to suicidality, this is a recent paper that goes through the summary of 4 main skin conditions, and comparing it with some psoriasis, we see increased suicidality, especially amongst females with atopic dermatitis, where we see the 25% compared with 5% in males with suicidal planning, and with intention, and attempts are also high in females compared with males. The other 2 comparators they used was people with problematic acne and bipolar depressive disorder. So looking at molecules, the cytokine hypothesis of depression has suggested that depression itself may be triggered by inflammation, and most of the studies have focused on interleukin-1, interleukin-6, and TNF as triggers for activation of serotonin transporters, indoleamine 2,3-dioxygenase, and the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Of course, even amongst psychiatrists, there is some debate about the relative importance of these pathways, and that there probably are other factors involved which relate to emotional and neuron damage contributing to depression. A look of the collection of papers here from this year. Again, we see interleukin-1, 6, and TNF playing a huge role among with a number of other markers, most of which do not resonate so much with our AD community. However, more recently, there have been expansion of the panels of biomarkers that have been tested, and many of these papers have been comparing the different types of depression. So I think it is important to note that, for example, unipolar and bipolar depressive disorders tend to have different biomarkers. And so if we're looking at different groups, we have to be relatively specific. Otherwise, we may get faulty data. So for example, with this one, we see that IL-33, as well as IL-6 and 18 are increased in bipolar depression, but not in the major depressive unipolar types. Two papers just to mention. One about the role of interleukin-4 and 13. This paper from China compared again unipolar and bipolar depressive disorders. The pictures are very small, but on the left of each of those 4 square segments, we see interleukin-4 and 13 top and bottom, and then there's interleukin-6 and TNF on the right of each quadrant. So you can see that the red block looks pretty high on the left pre-treatment, and then as we go down, it actually drops quite a lot with treatment, and that is monopolar disorder with both interleukin-4 and 13, whereas with bipolar depressive disease, the responders actually noticed an increase in interleukin-4. Sorry. Sorry about that. Yep. And more recently, this was examined in the context of suicidality, suicidal attempts in patients with major depressive disorders. Here we looked at 27 biomarkers with a plex panel analysis, and there were 2 types of analysis subsequently, one with principal component and the other one with elastic net penalized regression, which is not a model I'm that familiar with. Initial data did not suggest much difference, but subsequent analysis showed that interleukin-13 was the one biomarker that did show an increase in those with suicidal attempts compared with those without. Now, how does this work? It is thought that normally interleukin-13 stimulates astrocyte production of brain-derived neurotropic factor and is protective on the central nervous system. But under states of high oxidative stress, it works the other way and actually causes neuronal damage. And we see that in the ventral tegmental and substantia nigra on the studies that have been done, and that potentially that may translate into other changes, which we see manifest as hopelessness and impulsivity and those feelings that we associate with those parts of the brain. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. This is very early data, and I think it needs to be validated. I'd like to turn towards itch now as an intermediary. We know that itch, even without eczema, can cause significant mental health problems. Clinical depression, suicidal ideation, economic difficulties have been correlated in this 13-country collaborative study looking at odds ratios for those with itch compared with those without. The chronicity of itch here didn't seem to make that much of a difference. So what is it about itch? I mean, is itch something from outside? Is it something from inside? How do we understand, the identity between the itch as part of me that's itching or something that's affecting me? So the understanding of this has been a little bit complex, and there has been concept called MWAPO concept, which has been advocated by a number of writers, including Dr. Misery, which looks at different dimensions of understanding the skin. The skin is first an interface between us and the outside world, but it's also a means of communication between us and developing relationships. So there's a presentness to the understanding of skin in the way we relate to the others. And it also relates to our past, because it's also a container of good feelings that we've developed. Here it says in the nursing period, but I don't think it has to be confined to that, but past experiences which we may see pleasurable or otherwise. And this has been used to develop understandings of the way we regard our skin, both in terms of the skin itch causing an impact on our lives, and also stressors affecting our response to itch. But towards the end of the talk, I'd like to discuss one more aspect which relates to not just the present and the past understanding of skin, but also the future understanding of skin, which is another slightly newer development in the MAPO concept. I don't think anyone's actually written it up, but it seems to be related to some of the new directions in psychology. So with regards to the processing of itch, we won't discuss that too much. I think Berlin will go into that in more detail, especially in the peripheries. However, centrally, we do know that there is a lot of overlap between itch pathways and other parts of our body in terms of understanding emotion and also behavioral. So there's a little review article in the JID, which I think summarizes this quite well. And you can see that the orange ones relate to emotional pathways, the blue marks relate to sensory pathways, the green to motivational pathways, and there is quite an overlap with the itch pathways. So when we look at itch and atopic dermatitis, there have been a number of studies looking at parts of the brain affected by itch. And here in particular, we see that in AD patients compared with those without AD and who are itchy, we see this highlighting in the precuneus and the post-cingulate cortex, which we don't tend to see in the other patients. So there might be something quantitative and qualitatively different about the types of itch that is experienced in AD. The same authors then looked at the issue of contagious itch, and here we're using experimental videos of creepy crawly insects on the skin and itchy stimulus to evoke a sensation of itch. And we notice that there are a number of parts of the brain shown here which tend to be activated preferentially. So how does this correlate with what we see clinically and psychologically? Well, there was one study which was the same group which looked at psychological and personality parameters in patients with AD, and they noted that there was a consistent finding of low agreeableness amongst those who tended to scratch themselves a lot with the contagious itch video. So the question is this group predisposed because of the pathway issues or because of something else? That question is not yet answered, but I would like to turn to aspects of the emotional brain, which we tend to think more about in the context of itch. So if we have stimulated itch, often we get an activation of a number of parts of the brain, including the amygdala and hippocampus region, the anterior cingulate cortex, the mid-cingulate cortex, and the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is divided into two parts, one of which gets activated and the other one inhibited. And when we scratch the skin, we see that in some of these areas we get deactivation, presumably making us feel different, but in other parts, in particular the mid-cingulate cortex, we get activation, which may suggest that this itch response is actually neurally driven by a pleasurable sensation of the itch, which we know, but that there is actually a modulation in the pathway itself. Just as the quality of itch may be different in AD, the emotional correlates of itch may also be different. And for most of us, we tend to use the visual analog scale or the numerical rating scale, and we do not tend to use lengthy questionnaires. This was a little abstract from Professor Weng, which looked at the Eppendorf itch questionnaire from a few years ago, which is a fairly lengthy questionnaire, and they noticed that the type of itch that was described in AD was different from the type of itch that was described in contact urticaria. So it is possible that there is some qualitative difference as well as different activation parts in the brain. So how does this affect us in the clinical setting? Well, it can affect the itch-scratch cycle, as we've just mentioned. But it also suggests that cognitive processes, which we know are moving to and fro from different parts of the cortex to these deeper emotional parts of the brain, can play a mediating influence. And so the place of cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is becoming more of a topical area of study now, and that particular aspects that we need to focus on include those of the attention as well as the affect and expectancy of patients when dealing with itch, and in particular in our case, AD itch. But just to conclude the issue of itch, to also make a note that if doing study on this, we should really discern our subgroups of patients, because we know that not all itch affects us equally, even with the same condition, and there can be other variables such as ethnicity, gender, temperature of the skin, and of course the body site, which may moderate the degree of quality life, of life influence of the symptom. And also that there can be different sensations, such as skin pain, which I think we still don't understand very well, which may also play a role in these patients. And thirdly, that there can be interactions between the different comorbidities, in particular between itch, sleeplessness, and depression, which may modulate these effects. So we'll now turn from itch to insomnia briefly. And again, just to give you a brief update on what we have come across in the recent years. Insomnia with pediatric AD, we have known for a long time, and a number of important papers have shown that it does affect us at different phases of the sleep cycle. Just a couple of points to note is that even patients with very mild or absent AD clinically who do have a history of AD can still have an increased risk of insomnia, that it is common and can be mediated by environmental influences. We won't talk about these too long. And that even by correcting the AD of a flare, even though the parental perception of sleep loss is mitigated, the objective sleep quality of the child may not be affected. And finally, that the parental influence of sleep loss is also important to consider when we're doing studies on this, because parental hostility and mental health in children is also a huge problem. So, for example, mothers experience many different phases of subjective negative emotions when dealing with children with poor sleep. And even if the child's sleep becomes normalized, it is still a problem. We know that insomnia can cause a range of mental health problems in adults. We won't go through this in detail, but a number of different short-term manifestations of insomnia include these, as I think most of us have experienced at one stage or other. And when chronic insomnia sets in, some of these are very difficult to reverse. So management of insomnia, I won't dwell on for the sake of this talk, but behavioral and cognitive therapies are important, mainly because they do overlap with the treatment of those other parameters which are also contributing to mental health problems. When you're looking at the brain structure with insomnia, we do notice that there are changes as well with chronic insomnia. In blue on the right, we see areas on the top where you actually get relative atrophy or underdevelopment of the brain in people who have long periods of sleep loss. The red ones are whether they seem to be accentuated. And again, we have a number of primarily affected regions, including the hippocampus and thalamus, which also intersect in the processing of emotions and motivation. The third comorbidity we'll touch on now is the one of ADHD. We know that the adjusted odds ratio for children with AD is increased. A more recent paper suggests it may be as high as 2.5 compared with adults who do not have AD. And that the extent of severity also affects us quite remarkably. So for example, if you have severe AD and you don't have more than 3 nights good sleep in a week, the adjusted odds ratio jumps up to 16. In talking about ADHD, primarily we're talking about early ADHD, which is that which begins before 8 years of age. We also have late onset ADHD. The data for that is not so clear. But we do know that the 2/3 of those with impairment from ADHD will carry that into adulthood, and that there seems to be a slight increased prevalence amongst males. And the features of ADHD we won't discuss here, but I think you'll be familiar with. Again, we see an intersection of the factors affecting ADHD in children and those which may contribute to other emotional and mental health problems. Parental hostility, maternal deprivation, sleep disturbance, possibly the use of antihistamines, and also systemic inflammation itself can contribute directly to ADHD, but may also be mediated and accentuated in our patients with AD. Just a quick picture again of the brain regions which have been associated with ADHD. Again, we see a sort of a fairly strong highlighting of this area around the emotional centers of the brain, and also possibly the visual processing centers may play a role as well in some of the more recent data. Cognitive impairment has also been more recently described. For purposes of time, we'll just talk about this briefly, that a few papers by Dr. Silverberg's group, prospective one of adults, which have shown a considerable rate of cognitive dysfunction in patients with AD. These are adults, and there seems to be some correlation with severity of disease, and that these tend to have long-lasting influences with persistent cognitive impairment in about 1/3 and fluctuating in about 1/2 of those affected. Some it does resolve, but the minority. There are some higher risk groups according to ethnicity and, as mentioned, the severity of the AD. And it can affect us in a number of different ways, in particular memory impairment, developmental delay, and ADHD itself. A Danish study recently published shows very similar results, especially in those in low secondary school and in young adults who scored lower on tests. How much is true lower IQ versus distractibility and so on affecting the test results is not too clear. But overwhelmingly, in the papers published to date, data does confirm that there is a real effect on children's school performance and cognitive function when affected with atopic dermatitis. So I'll just finally close with this issue of self-stigmatization, which I think is important. We have talked about the correlations, but ultimately the issue of internalization of stresses seems to be the thing that is affecting personalities in AD, and that can be how they perceive them being self-discriminated, how they actually see themselves as being lacking in worth, and also how they see themselves as particular stereotypes. So we're all familiar with this issue of alienation by the community that some of our more severe patients experience, and the reciprocal emotional responses and with social withdrawal. What happens here is somewhat complex and probably affects multiple levels of interaction. First of all, having a predetermined idea of normality, and that they somehow differ from that, and a result of that they must be less worthy. And the response to that, which is shown in the circles, is highly varied, ranging from social avoidance to social assimilation. But opening the forum to discussion of that is the way that therapy is designed. And more recent studies have suggested that we should really be focusing on 3 specific aspects. One of the self-stigma itself, which is conceptual, the self-esteem, which is perceptual, and the self-efficacy, which is more behavioral. And with each of these steps, we can help our patients to adjust. So an example of this is this diagram, which has been used for the treatment of stigmatization in diabetes. And I think this was a fairly successful approach that was adopted in Japan and can be adapted to our AD patients potentially as well. So looking at addressing each of those issues of stigma, efficacy, and esteem separately. Noting that relationships seems to be the primary concern of these patients. Just in closing, two further things. One comment about mindfulness-based interventions. This is very novel. I can only find one paper discussing this, which was published in the last year. And it is trying to use mindfulness to focus on the present to evaluate the emotions that accompany each of those sensations that our patients experience. And if we are in centers where we have experts on this kind of therapy, it may be worthwhile to discuss with them about where this might sit in our treatment. The second one is this issue of social avoidance. And that is one thing which I think is very real, but at the moment understudied. It has been looked at in chronic illnesses of a number of sorts, and it is known that if we avoid situations because of emotional negativity that we associate with that from the past, we often will sort of almost stop the possibility of a future. And as a result of that, there are a lot of negative influences on health behaviors. As mentioned, this researcher, psychologist from Durham, has recently looked at how this may shape the cycle of ongoing emotional baggage and inability to progress, whether it be trying to be able to make decisions about AD therapy or progressing onto mental unwellness. And that we adapt these ruminative thought patterns and maladapting coping mechanisms in relationship to the stress response because we've run out of defense mechanisms and we're too scared to want to try to risk experiencing that negative emotion again. So she wrote about this in the setting of COVID stress, and I think it sort of resonates even more strongly with AD stress, and it's probably an area that we need to examine further. And one thing that she does talk about is our future sense of self, and which is tied in with the hopelessness that can happen with mental illness. And if we can help children and adults reshape the understanding of a hoped-for self, then it may allow us to work with them to achieve that. So I'll end there, but there is a lot that needs to be done both in terms of research and multimodal treatments, and hopefully we can find psychologists that can work with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Su. That was incredibly informative and very interesting. I wish I had your type of knowledge for the psychological impacts of AD and how we best treat them for all of our patients, I'm sure. So right now we are going to have a 15-minute break, but if you don't mind sticking around, Dr. Su, in case people have questions you can come up and please ask in person, and then we will resume promptly at about 10:15 after our bathroom and refreshment break. Thank you guys so much.